Hello, and welcome to the Ransomware Is It the Ultimate Malware session. My name is Eric Hibbert, and I will be covering today's topic. I'm with PrivSec Consulting LLC. I'm a practicing security and privacy professional with many years of work in the international standardization of cybersecurity and privacy activities within ISO and IEEE. Also heavily involved with the Storage Networking Association, the American Bar Association, and the Cloud Security Alliance. I also chair the Security Technical Work Group within SNIA. So this is the abstract for this session, and hopefully we live up to what's been previously published. We will definitely cover malware in some detail and then switch into the topic specifically for ransomware. Okay, so we're going to cover a background on malware. It's important to have a good foundation on what is malware and how it behaves or misbehaves, and then take a look at current ransomware. When I say current, as in late 2019 and this year, because with COVID-19, lots of changes in this space. And then at the end of the session, we'll talk about some of the ransomware countermeasures that may actually be possible. All right, so let's start with the malware background. So I've got a couple of definitions here. They're both out of ISO standards. 27033 is one of the networking standards. 27032 is a cybersecurity standard. But as you can see with some highlights here, there's a lot of commonality here. So you see the words malicious and designed and software. So that's kind of at the heart of this. Is somebody's actually designing this stuff to do bad things. In terms of what it does, it's damage or disrupt or harm. Again, some consistency here. And who does that apply to? And it's either a system, or in the case of cybersecurity, there's the possibility of users. And part of the reason for that is 27032 has a broader context and is looking at things like cloud and IoT and artificial intelligence, where a human could actually be affected with malware. All right, so we're going to go through some of the common types of malware, and you'll see a little later that knowing what these various pieces are can actually be important. So first up, and they're not in any particular order, is viruses. And essentially this is a piece of code that it inserts itself into an application and executes when the application is run. The next one is a worm, and this is basically a piece of code that can run autonomously. So once it gets into a system or into a network, it will tend to sort of spiral out and hit anything and everything that it can basically find. So it's a little different once it arrives. It likes to replicate. Trojans are, again, hidden code. It's typically embedded in software that's desirable. So for example, games or something of that nature. And it's really used to do unauthorized collection and falsification or destruction of information. Adware, which is not nearly as nasty as the first three, but it is in and of itself a problem, especially if you're concerned about privacy, because basically they're profiling your activities and building up, for example, insight into your contacts, things you're interested in, where you shop, what you do, things of that nature. And ultimately, that information can be shared or sold to advertisers. And the whole idea is to basically do direct, hit you with advertisements that are likely to be consumed by you. But the amount of information that can be amassed on you can be extensive, and you have no role in terms of consent or even know that this is going on in some cases. The next is spyware, and this is software that has the purpose of basically trying to collect sort of critical details like passwords and PINs and payment information, again, without your you knowing what's going on or your consent. Keyloggers, which are sometimes employed with some of the others, and in particular the spyware. This is actually intended to capture details associated with your input devices, in particular your keyboard. So imagine you've got a bit of spyware that's running and it sees that you're going into a particular bank account. Well, an attacker is probably going to be particularly interested in that. And this is where a keylogger can be very handy, because they'll have some detail on, okay, so you are at XYZ bank, and they'll capture the stream of characters, which basically represents your user ID and password or PIN or however you're going in. Even biometric information can be intercepted in some cases, depending on how that's inputted. The next one is fileless malware. This one's particularly nasty because it doesn't actually, unlike all the other codes that we've been talking about, this one doesn't actually result in it being stored anywhere. So this puppy basically drops into memory where it's actually running, and then it can actually reach out and pull in additional code from an external source, and also pull that into memory. So many of the antivirus products are watching for changes to the file system or individual files. In addition, because this thing is running in memory and it may actually be running with certain privileges, it can actually make some minor and subtle changes to the operating system. It can change permissions, ownership, things of that nature. And like I said, many of these cannot be caught by antivirus software because of the nature of how it's running. Next one is rootkits. This is another nasty. Think of this as a piece of software that slides in underneath your operating system, or if you're running a hypervisor, it might slide in underneath the hypervisor, or if you're running a set of virtual machines, again, it might be underneath the virtual machines. So in general, what this means is that if you're running any kind of security software, it's very unlikely that it will catch this because it's actually running below the level of where the software, the applications are actually running. We've seen this in several instances a few years ago. Even a particular entertainment company actually employed a rootkit, which when the security world learned of it, caused them a great amount of grief. These can be very hard to get rid of. In many cases, you have to basically go back and do a clean install on the system and then reinstall everything and bring in the data afterwards. Next category is bots and botnets, when you have a bunch of them working together. This software is basically, it's written to do task automation, typically commands. In and of itself, bots aren't necessarily a problem. It's just when they get together and there's a remote command and control mechanism that fires them off. This is a tool that's used for distributed denial of service attacks. And historically, it would be something like a bunch of PCs would suddenly be activated to go after a particular website. More recently, we're seeing that these kinds of techniques can be used for example, with cameras that are connected to the internet. So this is where IoT married to botnets can produce some very nasty little denial of service attacks. The next one is cryptojacking. This is basically mining for cryptocurrency. There's a fair amount of this malware running around. Many home PCs have something of this nature running on it. It's relatively straightforward to catch if you're running antivirus software, but given the amount of compute resources needed to mine cryptocurrency, there are a lot of bad guys out there that are looking for your system as a resource. The next one is ransomware, which is what we're going to spend time talking about in a little bit. And basically, ransomware uses encryption to essentially disable access to data until a fee is paid, a ransom is paid. It's important to note that there's no guarantee that when the payment is made, that the decryption key will be provided or that it will actually function properly. We've seen that happen on occasion as well. Okay, so those are some of the more prevalent forms of malware. So how does this stuff get around? One of the big problem areas is vulnerabilities, and this is particularly true for ransomware. So there are a lot of systems that are basically unpatched or marginally patched, applications that haven't been updated. They themselves may have vulnerabilities, which makes it incredibly easy for attackers to basically come at your system and gain administrative access, if you will, and they can do basically anything they like. Another problem area is backdoors, although there's a lot that's said about this. This is essentially an opening in the software, hardware, or network, or even system security that allows somebody to come in. Think of a backdoor as there's a standard default user ID password that somebody who's doing an install for an operating system might have. And if they didn't clean up after themselves, then that account is sitting there with a known password. That's a sort of a common problem that would fall into this category. So drive-by downloads, this is unintended downloads of software. So you may have been doing some surfing in a particular website, and unknowingly one of the things that you clicked through or hovered over resulted in something being downloaded through your browser onto your system. The next one, the homogeneity, it's not really a mechanism for spreading viruses, but it's definitely an enabler. So if you've got an environment where you've got 1,000 PCs all running exactly the same operating system, same applications, makes it easy to administer, makes it equally easy to basically harvest from a malware perspective. And so if you're running in one of those environments, then it's particularly important to make sure that the security mechanisms you have on the systems or in general to protect them are up to date and adequate for the task. Privilege escalation. This is basically any way an attacker can get access to essentially administrative accounts or privileged accounts. Unfortunately, one of the easy ways to do this is to basically guess, or somebody might refer to it as cracking passwords, but it's basically if you've got a weak password in the form of my dog or something like that, or password, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which are the two very common passwords. Attackers are likely to get those. Once they've gotten into a system, then there are lots of exploits that they can use to elevate their permissions. And once there, they can do lots of entertaining things and use that platform as an attack vector for other parts of the infrastructure. And then blended threats. This is where multiple components of malware are used to perpetrate the final attack. And in fact, many of the more expensive malware attacks are actually perpetrated as a blended set of attacks. So it arrives a particular way, And there may be several months from the initial attack to the ultimate release of the malware, the target being to basically take down everything, and everything might be in the form of 10,000 PCs, and they want to basically hit everything at the same time. Okay, so what are the kinds of things that you can do to combat malware? Well, as I mentioned earlier, patching and updating operating systems and browsers and plugins on a regular basis is definitely a smart move. If you're used to running on PCs, then you probably are familiar with Microsoft's Patch Tuesday, monthly release of patches. You probably want to be as current on that as you can be, given this is one of the known problems for ransomware. Likewise, we're seeing applications as a problem area. Years ago, attackers would focus on the underlying system. They'd go after BIOS and things of that nature. And they went after the operating systems, and they moved up the stack to browsers. And now, in general, they're going after a wide variety of applications. Some of them actually have specialized on the tools that they go after. You should definitely be using any and all security tools that you can avail yourself of, and again, keeping them up to date. So, for example, in the case of antivirus software, it doesn't do much good to install the antivirus software and then never activate it to download the signature files, because the only protection you have is what was part of that initial install, and the threat landscape for malware changes on a radical basis. Hundreds of new forms of malware on a daily basis. Social engineering plays heavily into malware, in particular phishing emails, and this is definitely the case with ransomware, as you'll see. So it's important if you are supporting users to just sort of clue them into the role that social engineering plays in it, and don't click on that link if you're not really sure. It doesn't make sense, and of course, never provide a password, over email. Nobody who would be administering and supporting your systems would actually ask for your password. Most likely, they could already get it. As I said already, don't click on links and do downloads from untrusted or unknown sources. You'd be surprised the number of people that get in problems with this. Practice safe browsing, have strong passwords. Strong passwords, at least 8. Personally, I prefer 12. Don't use dictionary words. The list is long and distinguish the things that you should and shouldn't do here, but you'd be surprised how little time it takes for an attacker to get a simple password. Definitely avoid using unencrypted public connections. So if you're using a hotel Wi-Fi, you're begging for trouble. You have no idea what's lurking on that network, and it may not actually be in the hotel. They may be sitting outside, in a car or something. And then, as we say in the world of security, defense in depth. Basically, layer your security. So you want to avail yourself as many capabilities as possible. So if you're in an enterprise, this is where firewalls can be important. They can help, antivirus software, endpoint protection kinds of tools, and the list goes on. But using as many of those you can will help. All right, so let's talk a bit about ransomware. All right, so what are we seeing in terms of the infection vectors? Vectors as in how are we seeing the attacks come in? And over the last 6 to 9 months, we're continuing to see spam and phishing email as a major source of the initial infections. And again, remember when we were talking about malware that might be hybrids, ransomware, unless it's sort of the garden variety, almost script kiddie kind of ransomware, is going to involve sort of multiple stages, if you will. Weak passwords, again, we were talking about. Guess what? Shows up again. Drive-by downloads again. So nothing really terribly new in those first few. Free software is another area that that free game or that free tool or that free document or free picture just is so enticing, and of course it has a little payload that it brings along. Another area that we're seeing, especially with ransomware, is the use of remote desktop protocol, RDP, which is definitely heavily used in the Windows environments. And any poorly configured, misconfigured, or even the running RDP can be a source of problem with regard to ransomware. All right, to give you kind of an idea of how big a problem this is, projections for 2020, and they vary a bit, but essentially $20 billion worth of damage is the estimate for this year. And with what's going on with everybody working from home and going to school from home and continuing to do that, these estimates may actually be low. We've also seen over the last 3 or 4 years a transition where ransomware was kind of focused at the individual basis, and now we're seeing businesses being explicitly targeted. And so in 2019, those businesses that did get hit, it was about $133,000 is the cost to basically deal with one of these. But what we're seeing in the first half of 2020, those numbers are actually expected to go up. All right, so I have a bunch of some of the top ransomware threats that we're seeing in 2020. I'm not going to go through and talk about each one of these, but I'm gonna highlight some things that are associated with some of these guys. So you'll see, several of these will show that it is basically exfiltrates data. It's essentially pulling data off. And from a ransomware perspective, this is a relatively new trend in that the attackers have figured out how to further incentivize payment. So what they'll do is, once they know they basically have the ability to do the encryption, in other words, nail you, what they'll often do is make a copy of the data on that system prior to actually doing the encryption. In other words, they have something that you probably want, and their intention is not to basically give it back to you. Their intention is actually to threaten to release it into a public setting. So you can imagine if you are, in an HR department and you've got all kinds of personnel information that they've managed to get a copy of, and that's going to be part of the package. So if you don't pay, then you can pretty much guarantee that information is going to show up somewhere. And depending on the nature of that data, it could be very, very problematic. You see the second item in here, the REvil. This is a particularly nasty attack. It actually hit the entertainment and media industry relatively recently, and the ransom was $42 million. So this is one where the exfiltration component is served as an incentive to actually pay the ransom. In some cases, even if the data is not recovered, keeping it out of the public's eye is one of the desires. The third one on this list is this is something that hit in Japan, and it was impacting industrial control systems, and in particular, at least one car manufacturer. that essentially went offline for several days. There wasn't a whole lot of noise about it, but in terms of what was paid or not, but this is, again, here's one where they've basically specialized. Tycoon, you see that this one's actually keying off of JRE, and they're going after SMEs, which is a little different than some of these other ones that are now actually going after the larger enterprises, because they see that as more lucrative. And number 5, phishing email. This one's particularly nasty in that once infected, what it means to spreads laterally. It basically reaches out and touches all of its neighbors. In fact, every neighbor it can find. Number 6 is dealing with sort of the banking. It's a banking Trojan, and particularly nasty for the financial institutions. Number 7 is another Java-oriented. This one has the twist that there's, unlike a lot of these other ones where it's sort of a point and shoot and it goes off and does its own thing. This one's actually a human operator. So you've got an attacker who's engaging during the whole sort of kill chain, the whole process of getting the ransomware going. Like I said, many of these are take quite a bit of time to get to the point where they pull the trigger on when the encryption actually happens. And this one, definitely we're seeing humans in the loop, so to speak. The number 8 on this list is a COVID-19 special. They are intentionally putting stuff out there that's COVID-19 related, as we say, lures. So it's one of those that's been customized. Number 9 specializes in remote management software. So it also pulls data off. Number 10 is dealing with, they focus on tech and healthcare companies in both the EU and US. Number 11 is dealing with RDP ports that are poorly secured. Number 12 is an example of something that has extreme amount of automation in terms of going after its victims. Number 13 is focused on ATMs, and there's at least one instance where a ransom of $660,000 was paid. Number 14, likewise, is about a $300,000 ransom associated with this. And number 15 is one of the newer ones, and we expect that for 2020 is going to show up high on the list. It's very nasty in that it has the ability to bypass a lot of the anti-ransomware methods that are out there. So this is one where the attackers have been paying attention to the countermeasures and have adapted, and so this puppy is got a lot of capability and very hard to block. All right, just to talk about some statistics here. So what's the prevalence of ransomware? Well, it's kind of interesting because you see 2017, about 54% of organizations had some sort of ransomware presence. In 2020, that's estimated to be about 51%. Actually, I think it's going to be low because of COVID. But it's, I guess it's holding fairly constant. In terms of impact, we're seeing that about 73% of the time where there is an attack, they are successful in encrypting the data. So about 24% of the time, we're seeing instances where they were able to, so the enterprises, the victims were able to basically stop the attack. And there's there's about 3% where the data wasn't encrypted, but the ransom was still paid. And this is kind of back to my earlier comment about if they had removed the data and were threatening to put it in the public setting, then there's still a motivation to pay to prevent that. In terms of getting data back, what we're seeing right now is about 94% of the victims get their data back. That's the good news. The not so good news is about 56% use their own backups to basically get the data back. So even though you've got the encryption key from the attacker, you may still actually have to go back to your own backups to get the real data restored because of various problems and whatnot. This is the ransomware as a service is actually alive and well. You can see that the orange color is showing multiple strains that are of that ilk. It also gives you an idea of kind of the spread of what's the cost of a ransom, and you see that there are several that are quite expensive, and then to the far right, they get increasingly cheaper and cheaper. And so you can pretty much guess that the ones on the far right are more targeted towards consumers and households. The ones more on the left tend to be, enterprise kinds of things. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ransomware countermeasures. I don't want to get your hopes up too high. So let's start by talking a bit about a simplistic ransomware kill chain. So kill chain is, what are the steps that the attacker basically has to think through, has to deal with? If you know what those, what the kill chain is, then if you can block any one of those steps in the kill chain, then effectively you've blocked some or all of the attack. All right. So the first step that attackers typically have to deal with is, what's the suitable bait? What are they going to use to essentially get into your environment? And for example, many of them will actually choose some sort of a phishing email with an infected attachment. The old way or the best ways. It still works. Nothing like a cute kitty picture or whatever. That's the kind of thing that they'll definitely take advantage of. So the next piece, once they've got the bait, is dealing with how you get the malware actually installed on the target system. And many of these, there is a target. It may be a target organization, target department, a particular class of systems, but they've basically thought through what they're going after. It's also important to note that the initial installation isn't necessarily activation of the malware. In other words, it doesn't immediately start encrypting the minute it's installed. It can actually lay dormant for months before some sort of command is issued, and then it goes, okay, now I do it. And these are the kind of scenarios where if a large enterprise is being attacked and they want to basically take down the entire enterprise in one shot, they'll take quite a bit of time to get all this code installed and configured correctly before they'll activate it. Okay, so at this point, they've got they've figured out how they're gonna, who they're targeting, how to get it onto the system. The next thing they've got to basically worry about is the encryption key that's going to be used for the encryption. Because remember, they need to know what that encryption code is, or key, so that they can give it to you after you've paid the ransom. And in the early days, they used exactly the same encryption key. They quickly figured out, for the same reason security people figured out, using the same key everywhere. Once somebody knows what it is, oh, I'll just use this key, and you're golden. Well, every one of these attacks will use a different encryption key. Now, if you're having a large attack, so let's say you've got 10,000 PCs that are being attacked, they may in fact actually use the same encryption key on every one of those systems just to make it easy for you from a ransom perspective, or maybe I should say easy for them, because all they have to worry about is getting you one encryption key, and they don't have to worry about which one is associated with which system. Once the key is basically available to the system, they have the ability to execute the encryption code. However, this is the point where if they're going to do any data exfiltration, they'll do this before they actually do the encryption. And again, this is part of the reason why some of these attacks can actually take quite a bit of time, because they may be more interested in pulling down lots of data, or enough data to basically scare you with the threat of basically releasing that. And then execution of the encryption code, and then as part of the package, there's a ransom demand that is put up so that you can see it. And typically there's a deadline. So if you don't do anything, then the way it works is if they've pulled data down, they release the data into the wild. If they didn't pull data down, then they sort of move on, but you're on your own then. There's not going to be a recovery because they may have gotten rid of the encryption key. They will tend to wait, especially if it's a large ransom, and especially if there's some sort of negotiation or engagement that's happening. Do keep in mind the ransom is typically done through the use of cryptocurrency, and that can be problematic. When you first get an account, there may be a significant limit on the amount of currency you can purchase initially. So we've seen many instances where the ransom is quite expensive. You may need to actually engage third parties to help you deal with that piece, even if you want to pay the ransom. Okay, so how do you go about minimizing ransom risk? Well, to start with, you need to really assume that you will be a victim, because that's gonna change your outlook on how you approach this. If you take the alternate approach, was put your head in the sands and say it won't be me, you're pushing your luck based on the statistics we're seeing, and we don't see ransomware diminishing anytime soon. In fact, we think it's going to continue to increase and get nastier to guard against. User education and training, especially around phishing and social engineering, is a huge area where you can invest some time and potentially get some good payback on it. It's the human is truly the weak link in this problem. You want to minimize the attack surface. This is back to making sure you're patching vulnerabilities, make sure your antivirus software is up to date, disabling unnecessary services, and in particular RDP, which you've seen a couple of instances already. If you have the resources, consider investing in anti-ransomware technology. So endpoint monitoring and protection is one of those possible. Those technologies are specifically watching for activities that involve encryption, and especially if it's not what you normally do on your system. You want to protect the data wherever it's held. So if it's public cloud, private cloud, on-premise, it's important to know where your data is, or at least the data that you care about, and make sure that in each of those locations that you've got adequate backups, if you will, or archives, or whatever you want to use. But you want to make sure that you're looking at all the places that you keep the data. Increasingly with COVID, Enterprises are finding they've got a huge amount of data that's outside of the enterprises, sitting on laptops in home environments, which is less than ideal from a security situation. So that also sort of complicates how do you make sure you've got the data protected. You absolutely want to do regular and automated backups, and you want to store it offline and off-site. The offline is probably more important because some of these attacks that are spread out over months, the attackers will actually go on the hunt for backup systems and media that's like a NAS device or something of that nature. And if it's connected, they'll find it and they'll perpetrate the attacks to basically take it out as well. It's not uncommon to see the backup system as the first one to be attacked, or worse, it may actually be disabled days, if not weeks in advance. And if you're not paying attention, your backups are basically gone or corrupted. You want to have an incident response plan. So what do you do when you get hit? Sounds like a really simple thing, but a lot of organizations haven't thought through, who do we call? What do we do? Who's on point? Those are the kind of things that actually get taken care of in incident response plan. You do not want to be putting one of these together in the middle of a crisis. This also can be an important part if you've got the next one, cyber insurance. Oftentimes, they're going to want to see what your incident response plan is, or the fact that you've got one. So these two tend to go hand in hand. But if you do have cyber insurance, make sure you know what you're covered for from a ransomware perspective. There may be caps, there may be exclusions that could impact what your protection is. And again, deploy a layered defense. You want to cover as many of the vectors in an attack as possible. Think hybrid attack. They're going to come at you in a bunch of different ways. We've actually seen attackers they'll try something, they'll see that countermeasures are put up, they'll adjust their attack and come back. And if they don't see countermeasures, then they'll proceed. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game. And if you're being called out specifically as a potential big target, they will be persistent. So what happens if you're infected by ransomware? Well, if you've got an incident response plan, dust that puppy off as fast as you can and basically deal with it. But some things to keep in mind, and these are sort of just general steps. It's better to actually have your incident response plan to work through specifically. A lot of the ransomware has the ability to replicate itself through your environment, so you want to quarantine the affected system. And the easiest way to do that is to basically unplug the network cable. Now, obviously, that's not going to work if you're running in a Wi-Fi environment, so you're going to have to basically deal with that. But you get the general idea is that you want to essentially disconnect the system from the network, however you need to do that. You absolutely need to get your IT and security team involved. This is the team that's going to basically manage the incident. They're the ones that are going to be able to deal with this. And keep in mind that in some environments, for example, the healthcare industry, ransomware has been labeled as a data breach, and you have an obligation to report. If you're at least in the U.S. and in other jurisdictions as well. So you've got to get these people engaged, in those kinds of environments. Generally, it's recommended that you do not restart the computer. Part of the reason for this is you can actually have system files that get corrupted. So the system is running just fine, but when you go to reboot, it may not come back up because of what happened during the infection process. So imagine you get a file system table that's loaded in memory, but when you reboot, it basically has to pull that in. Well, if that file system table has been corrupted, the computer may not know where its storage is, and so it just sits there and stares at you. If you've got an infected drive, you do want to get an image backup of that, which is different than just a backup. So this is kind of like sometimes called a forensic copy. And the reason for that is part of the recovery, assuming you get the encryption key, part of that decryption process might actually cause some files to be destroyed or corrupted. And by having an image copy of it, you at least have something you can go back to and try and sort of work through that. Also, the disk encryption tools that do exist, you may be able to use some of those. We've seen that sort of the script kiddie kinds of scenarios where the malware has a flaw, and so there may actually be a recovery mechanism. There was a way to sort of sidestep the problem. And so it doesn't hurt to actually attempt to do a disk recovery, but you want to make sure that the people doing that know what they're doing, and that it's a documented process. So this is probably not something you want to do on your own if you're kind of an average user. Okay, so you're restoring the infected systems. You're basically going to have to go back to a clean install on the operating system and the applications. And you want to make sure you've done your patches, because we've seen instances where people have basically done a recovery, but they didn't really go and fix the root problem. And these guys will come back and just to annoy you, they might actually double or triple the ransom. So make sure you at least get back to where you were, and then try to, if you know how the attack happened, make sure that you dealt with that before you come full online. Of course, you've got to restore the data. Ideally, if the data's been static, going back to known good backups is the preferred way. Pulling the data out of media that's basically been affected can be problematic, because these ransomware tools do leave lots of droppings and leave the ability to basically fire up and continue to cause problems. And then if you've got removable media or connected drives, kind of depending on the state they were in when the attack occurred, you absolutely want to quarantine those and do what you can to sanitize those. So, assume that anything was connected to the system most likely has been infected some way, and could be used to reinfect and you enter the bonus round. Okay, a few final thoughts. So for ransomware, prevention is the best possible cure. As you can see, once you've been hit, there's really serious limits on what you can do. They're using encryption that was specifically designed to not be broken. And so it does its job. And so you can't assume that somebody's just going to break the encryption and you're going to be good. So do what you can to basically protect yourself up front. Make sure you've got appropriate security software installed and running and up to date. The up to date is actually critical. Backup, and backup. And keep in mind that a ransomware incident may be a reportable data breach for your organization, and failure to report can have, it could get you into the bonus round. So you paid a ransom, that becomes known through some mechanism, and then you've got the regulators or the authorities coming down saying, hey, you were supposed to disclose and you didn't. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. This was targeted to implementers, engineering teams, but also sort of the average user. The idea is to give you some insight into kind of what's going on in the ransomware state, because how you design systems, how you deploy systems, how you implement them can have a very big effect on whether a ransomware attack is actually going to be successful or not in the future. If you like this session, or if you didn't like the session, we do want to hear from you. So please do rate us and give us your feedback. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And hopefully this was helpful and useful. And maybe you never have to see one of these.